We're very lucky to be joined once again on the program after a long absence by Terrell, Jermaine, Starr. Welcome back.
Hey, thank you very much. I appreciate being here.
Great to have you on. By the way, I should have announced you're the host of the Black Diplomats podcast. You've previously come on our show to talk about foreign policy, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Not long ago, I came across a thread where you were responding to what you seem to be identifying as sort of evolving social media progressive consensus around the topic of Ukraine and the issue with Russia. And you're located in Kiev, working there, and to have a different perspective. So I was just curious to hear your thoughts, your experience, and what you think about all of what you've seen going on.
Well, so are you asking me about the thread, or are you asking me about what's happening here? Because I could do both, whatever.
I mean, your thoughts about the conflict. I mean, you did describe them in the thread, but you've been seeing what's going on, what the Ukrainian government has been saying, what the US government has been doing. So I'm curious how you see all of this developing.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah. So definitely I can get into that. So what's happening right now is that Russian President Vladimir Putin is creating a false narrative of security around around NATO, right? And so even though Ukraine is not a NATO member country, which means that they're not eligible to receive NATO support under Article 5, which dictates if a country, i.e. Russia, for example, decides to attack, then NATO will be obligated to shore up its own forces. And so right now there are roughly 175,000 troops around the Ukrainian border, including to the north of Belarus. In fact, military analyst Michael Nance, who I'm showing around kind of as a tour guide for him, he pretty much assessed that Kiev could be taken from the north, from Belarus, in a matter of days. It basically could be separated. So where I am right now, Russian forces could take this over in just a couple days, and because the Belarusian border is a few hours north, and so it is a very tense situation. So what's happening right now is this psychological warfare where you see these troop activities taking place, drills to the north, and these Azov and Black Seas also have been blocked off pretty much for Navy drills more specifically, which are designed pretty much as essentially economic blockade, because so much grain is produced in Ukraine and exported that those shipments and those shipping routes can be completely cut off by the Russian Navy. But as far as the diplomatic back and forth that's happening right now, what the U.S. is hoping to do is to work through some conversation with Putin by which he will withdraw these troops and not engage in a second attack. But the reality is that Russian military has been in Ukraine since 2014, and also there are tens of thousands of people who have been displaced out of Crimea, as well as eastern and western, as far as including eastern Ukraine, Luhansk, and the Donbass region. You saw the German chancellor in Washington recently, as you know, because Germany pretty much relies heavily on Russian gas, and so the Kremlin has been using gas as a blackmailing, as a tool to pretty much threaten Germany to force Ukraine into major concessions, which include possibly granting the Luhansk and Donbass regions official autonomy, thus giving the Kremlin more control over Ukrainian territory. But as far as if there's going to be any peaceful resolution to take place, that all depends on Putin, because at this point, there's not much that Putin wants outside of some major concession that will give him more power over Ukrainian territory.
And as of right now, while there has been a variety of forms of aid coming either from the United States or from European countries, the US is not moving troops into Ukraine or anything like that. One of the things I was hoping to get from you being on the show is obviously I'm not a regional expert by any means, clearly. So I'm seeing what, for instance, like the president of Ukraine is putting out in terms of his statements, that I don't know how to receive those. He says there's no reason for panic. We're not worried that Russian tanks are going to come across the border tomorrow. When you're talking to people in Kiev, is that what they feel? Or are they concerned that something could happen? Or is it easier to assume, as thousands of miles away where I'm at, that this could suddenly spring into a conflict any day, but that isn't actually realistic? What do you think?
Both are true. So the idea that a conflict can spark off is definitely true because the military because the military setup of the Kremlin is very much prepared to do so. Like I said, this country could be taken in a matter of days, in a week. It could be split in half. So no, that is very real. Now, when you ask people on the ground in regards to how do they feel about this and how are their reactions to it? The reality is, what can they do? They're used to this already. In fact, you see the videos that I post to my own Twitter about just walking through and life is going as usual because they're not, most people in this, they're not soldiers. Most people around the world are not soldiers. And so since they're used to it, their idea is, what can we do? But in regards to Zelensky, there are a couple of reasons why he's calling for calm. One, he does not want the hryvnia, the local currency, to crash. He does not want investor confidence in the country to dip because the country has worked since 2014 to regain the trust of the international community to invest in Ukraine and to invest in the idea that this is a stable country despite all of the challenges that it has had with corruption. And so it makes perfect sense for him to do that. And so I can definitely understand why people are saying, well, maybe Zelensky is underestimating the threat. But again, he has a country to run. He has an economy to consider. And so he is looking for, he's, in one way he's correct that people are used to it, but also if he allows the fear mongering or the fear mongering by the Kremlin, for example, that's being pushed on Ukraine to continue without speaking out against it, there's a legitimate fear that the investor trust that has taken so long to really build up to this point is going to go back to 2014 levels. And that's not something that a first-term president wants to deal with.
Yeah, definitely. So sort of related, I mean, I know you mentioned in explaining some of, from the Russian perspective, why they're worried about, for instance, Ukraine joining NATO. I've been trying to assess from what I can read how likely that was to be the case in the near future. And from all that I've read, it didn't seem as if Ukraine joining NATO was anything that was likely to happen in the near term, in literally years. So is that a thing where there's a miscommunication and Russia really is? I understand why they'd be concerned if it entered NATO, but it doesn't seem as if that's actually likely to happen. So am I wrong? Is the hopes inside of Ukraine that it would happen soon? Does it seem more likely?
That's a good question. And so it's very reasonable for you to not be sure-footed about what's happening because there's a lot of confusion about what's going on. So let's go back to your first question about Putin. For one, Russia is the largest country in the world. It covers multiple time zones. And last time I checked, I don't want to correct me if I'm wrong, but it has to be something like at least 10 time zones. I'm not exactly sure, but it's by far the largest country on Earth. And so there is no way when he says that NATO is encircling us, it's just practically not true. I mean, come on now, you can just look at a map and see that NATO forces do not extend that far because you have to remember on the other side towards the east is China. Okay. Okay, so they're not, and then up to the north, it's the Arctic where Russia covers the vast majority. There are 8 Arctic countries, and Russia is the largest one by far. So it's just false. So if you just look at a map, you know that Putin is wrong, regardless of what your personal opinion is, just from a factual level. That is incorrect. Now, when he talks about the NATO alliance, countries, there are some things you have to keep in mind. One, to the north or to the Russia's northwest, you have the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, for example, and then you have Belarus, which is pretty much, it functions as a satellite state of Moscow. And so there's a very small contingency of NATO troops located in that area because those countries are relatively tiny. And then you have Ukraine, which is not a NATO country, and then you have a Warsaw Pact. Then you have Poland, right, which is a NATO country. So technically, they're not really encircling Moscow like he says that they are. And what's also important, and this is where I go back to my thread. So the reason why a lot of these countries are joining NATO is that most of them, whether they are former Warsaw Pact countries or former USSR countries, which is what, the latter of which Ukraine is, the issue is that they all were colonized at some point by Russia. And so in order, and so after 1991, after the Soviet Union fell, they all ran towards NATO. This was not a Washington, Brussels initiative. So this was not a unilateral gain. Now, obviously, they benefited from it. So listen, we have plenty of robust critiques about NATO, the large military industrial complex. Listen, you can bring me on, and I have no problem giving you a rundown of my critiques of it. But what's specifically happening here is that you have the dozen or so countries that decided to join because they knew that their militaries were not strong enough to repel a offensive from Moscow. And that's something that they feared independent of what the US and what Brussels thought. And so so ultimately the question is very simple. If it was not for NATO expansion, if it were not for NATO expansion, one could say that the same issues that Ukraine is dealing with right now as a non-NATO country, the rest of Europe will be dealing with, because Germany itself, up until 1989, had Russian troops on their soil. And so that's very important context when we talk about the dynamics of NATO. It's a lot more nuanced and complicated than people discuss.
For more political news, breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.